Namaste, friends, and welcome to our Poetry Lab with Dr. Parikshit Singh. Thank you, Dr. Singh, for joining us, especially since you are the author and the poet of this book, Satya Poems to My Father. It's very rare that we get a chance to talk to a poet about the, background, the narrative, the circumstances of composition, and also to go poem by poem into the creative process. So this, I think, should be very useful to all lovers of poetry, but also a good record for the future about, especially in this age of AI, when poetry is going to be, I think, more and more written not by human beings, but by artificial intelligence, which will trawl through, these LLMs will trawl through the entire creative corpus of great writers and poets, and who knows? So I think we're at a very interesting cusp. And speaking of cusps, this book is also about the transitions between life and death and what lies beyond. And, in our tradition, in the Kathopanishad, there's a fantastic encounter between Nachiketas and Yama, what happens in the afterworld. And in a sense, Nachiketas doesn't come back. But we have the Upanishad, so somebody came back to tell us what happened over there. But in this dialogue with death, there is death, rebirth, and the poet is very much with us to explain this process. And in fact, the last episode was about, metamorphosis, what happens. And the metaphor there was the butterfly, how the butterfly emerges from the cocoon, from the chrysalis, and then, frees itself from that bondage, that cage in which it was born, and takes flight. Now, in the next few poems, viewers, you will find a number of animal and bird images coming in, So, the collection gets populated by non-human actors, and that I find very fascinating. So let's go next to this wonderful tiger poem on page 48. And in its own ways, it reminds us of the great poem by William Blake, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night. But Dr. Singh, over to you. I request you to please read the poem to us.
And I'm sure the tiger influenced subconsciously or consciously this poem too. So, because that tiger too is a tiger of flame in a way. If you have if you listen to some interpreters, they don't see it just as a poem for children, but as a beast manifesting some supra cosmic power. And even I think Amal Kiran read it as Christ himself, Christ the
Oh,
tiger.
yes. Even before him, it was seen.
Yeah.
In fact, did he who make the lamb make thee?
Yes.
So it gives a very different idea from the
Yes.
conventional Christian idea of divinity,
Yeah.
that both the ferocious, as well as the meek are aspects of the same force. And I
Yes.
think we've been seeing this in our parallel podcast, Amazing Vedas, which I
Yes.
invite all our viewers also to check out. And we see that, what should I say, the containment of contradictions, because from the point of view of the divine, there are no contradictions, are there?
Right. Right. All right. Let me read the tiger of flame. He leaps into sight with a roar of flame, devours vision with golden blight. He leaps on prey and sinks in flesh, the rising jugular ablaze with light, and strides away with glowing sinew, his limbs woven in furred opposite. The camouflage of fading skyline holds in space the streak of meteorite. I hear his echo by smoldering ashes, his gaze mirrored in noon and night, a leaping blur with face of stars and all background, a shade of white.
Beautiful. And viewers, as you can catch, there are rhymes not entirely regular, but sight, blight, light, opposite or opposite, meteorite, night, and white again. So please see that this whole poem is full of these sounds and rhythms, some of which I think are certainly from the overmind regions, as I've said to the poet myself. If you know the Aurobindonian idea of poetry, you know, the future poetry, it's such a wonderful book. One day we'll do a discussion on the future poetry as well in our series. But let me ask you this. You mentioned Blake, of course, and that idea of the opposites, that the ferocious can also be, you know, I would say, in fact, compassionate in its ferocity. If you ever see a tiger, it kills very quickly. You know, it's not going to linger on and torture the victim. Sometimes domestic cats do that. You know, they play with their victim, but not a tiger. And I'm reminded of a passage from Raman Maharishi, who says the guru is like a tiger because he clutches you by the throat, by the jugular. Now, the you there is the ego. Of course,
Yes. Yes.
the guru is the greatest ego slayer. So, can you tell us, like, what was going through your mind when this poem came to you, and how it relates to the themes in the book? You know, your father, his passing, the grief, and then going beyond the grief, loss, and also beyond loss to a kind of rebirth, recreation, if you will. And of course, the images of light, of Agni, again and again, you know, which permeate as light motives. They permeate the volume. Please.
So thanks to you, I'm looking at my poems with a critical eye. Usually I write and I'm done. But now that you got me into, and you bring in so many insights that I hadn't even thought about. So right off the bat, we can see that the Blake's tiger is hidden right there in the rhythms. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night. So night and blight and sight and light. These are Blakean. This is the Blakean hammer. It hits you hard. It's a whole beat is a trochaic beat, and hits you. It doesn't stop right through the whole poem. It's a very energized, energetic poem, and of course, this is not at any level, to be compared to his masterpiece, but it is somewhere subconsciously took his rhythms. At least it took the rhymes, but the tiger is for the Indian mind is a very, very powerful image. And don't forget Sri Aurobindo's beautiful poem on the tiger with the very powerful opening, which is a much longer opening. But coming to this here, of course, it's the fire devouring the body of what was once my father, and with that glaring appearance, and the glow, the mane. I mean, you can imagistically, you can probably see that immediate impression that this is a tiger eating him up. Every sinew, every part of the body going away. I'm losing him right off the bat, and I will not see him. This tiger is devouring him. But the Agni has a lot of significance in our tradition, in our psyche. And I think that comes out because, as we discussed in the previous, our previous discussions, that Agni becomes a father. We ask Agni to become a father to us, and right in the beginning of the Rig Veda. And that has always been a very fascinating thing to me. What is this Agni that you want to be your father? And one thing we know that our poets, Rig Vedic poets, were very fine poets. They wouldn't have used a simile without a proper purpose. The father with the distance of consciousness, but being there with the light always there, almost like something in the background, not like a mother, totally intimate, but as a father, a little further away, but protecting you. And to us, I think probably that has played on the subconscious. And of course, the image of uh, the Rudra, if you remember, the Rudra is one of the devas who's in some ways very powerfully related to Agni. And Rudra is, or actually Vishnu. Vishnu, he was a worshipper of Vishnu, Narayana. And Vishnu is shown as in the Rig Veda as the lion in the harshest places. He is walking like a lion. Vishnu is not always the nice and gentle Vishnu. Vishnu can be the lion. In the toughest of places where you need Vishnu to be a protector, that gentleness becomes a fierce aspect. And that, I think, played with him because he was a worshipper of Vishnu or Sri Krishna. So I think these are the images that I'm trying not to analyze myself too much. That's probably not a good thing for creativity. But looking back at it, and then I think the whole scene came together in a massive overtaking of that physical by this apparition, so to speak. You may be on mute.
I think it's very profound. I went to mute because, I really wanted to pay attention and didn't want any interference in the sound. But, the poem that you mentioned for our viewers, it's called The Tiger and the Deer, by
Yes.
Sri Aurobindo. And I always remember the last lines: the slain survive the slayer, you know, the mighty perish in their might, the slain survive the slayer. Now, I'm going to kind of link it up with some of the things we've talked about. But the opening lines, as you said, are so powerful. Brilliant, crouching, slouching, what crept through the green heart of the forest, gleaming eyes and mighty chest, and soft, soundless paws of grandeur and murder? But, again, this whole theme of contrast, I'm very sure that Sri Aurobindo, who had read his English poets thoroughly, knew of Blake and was again playing with the idea of the lamb and the tiger, here, the deer and the tiger. So the point is that which devours is also that which purifies. You know, it removes the dross in us. And to me, what you just said is so powerful because, when the flames consume, the body, the dead body, even of a dearest parent or relative, they devour it like a tiger almost. So as the flames rise, they almost resemble a tiger. And, you can imagine the scene, with bits of wood or whatever, flesh leaping up. It's like eyes. The flame has eyes, as you know, right? So it's a very powerful image, I feel. But as I said, Agni, it consumes, but it also purifies. Agni as the father. And the reason I brought in Sri Aurobindo here is that in his own ways, he's saying that life, survives death because there's no death as such. It's only, as the Gita says, Vasamsi jirnani yatha vidhaya. So you change your clothes, don't you? So in a sense, consciousness, Agni is also a form of consciousness, right? So as is water. So consciousness survives the shedding of the mortal coil. And you mentioned Vishnu. It's very fascinating because one of the avatars of Vishnu is the Narasimha avatar.
Yes,
You
that's
know
right.
how he tears open Hiranyakashipu, right? So again, these are very powerful images, and the Narasimha avatar, even the most meek and peace-loving of Vaishnavites, will invoke the Narasimha avatar when they are faced with a great threat. You see, which every civilization is faced with. So I think it's a wonderful poem, and our viewers, I'm sure, and readers and those who appreciate poetry, I think will see all the symbolism will resonate to the echoes of great poets past. I mean, certainly Blake, which is obvious, but also Sri Aurobindo, not so obvious, because again, this is not a poem that is so well known of Sri Aurobindo amongst his, tremendously inspiring oeuvre. And of course, who knows, Sri Aurobindo's poem, we'll get off on a tangent, but I think he also, by the tiger here, he really meant British colonialism, because, it's a wonderful poem. And he says that the deer, the Indians were like deer, to this predatory beast, which was imperialism. And yet the deer will also survive. So the slain survive the slayer. At least that's how I used to look at the poem. But the great thing about poetry is that every time you read a poem, you can recreate it anew, isn't it? And again, someday we have to discuss what happens with AI, because it's racial memory, after all. It's not just, individual creativity. And that's how we began. Poetry began as racial memory. That's one of the things we are talking about in our Amazing Vedas podcast, that though a rishi could, as it were, receive, a mantra or suktam or a rik of the Rig Veda, for example, it's not an individual's creation. That's why we
Yeah.
call it apaurushya. Maybe AI will become apaurushya in a different sense, because no individual is creating it. So, if you want to weigh in on this, then we'll end this episode of The Tiger here and move on to some other feathered friends in the next couple of poems.
The question I have, and I do not know the answer of it, is yes, maybe AI can give the body of a poem. Can it give the consciousness to the poem, the intuition that hits you when you create? Because poetry is not just reading a poem that's ready made. Poetry is the process of going through poetry. Sitting at the beach, you see a little heron, a white heron, and it's so white that suddenly the beach everything looks gray in comparison. And you suddenly have an insight, and almost a haiku bursts forth. Now, that process of creativity, that intuition, that insight into something very transient, but something that impacts your consciousness deeply, that is poetry. Now, how is AI going to bring us to that moment that the whole universe fades into grayness in front of that little white figure? How is that possible, right? And then a haiku bursts forth. Will AI, LLM do that? Not yet. Maybe someday it may reach a point where it has consciousness, but then you'll have to go to a very high level of probably metaphysics and psychology. And when it reaches consciousness, and maybe it can bring a universal consciousness, well, then maybe that is poetry. Because poetry is not just words. Maybe, Mallarmé would say it's words, ideas are not important, but consciousness is still there. And if in the process of my sitting and creating, if I go through an AI, then I have not transformed myself. I have not jumped into the fire. Poetry is me jumping into the yajna and being dissolved in that fire and that flame leaping forth. Isn't that what poetry is? And so, how is that going to replace it?
No, I tend to agree with you. I was just challenging the idea. AI cannot be conscious, at least not conscious in the way we are. But even so, it gives us a sort of basis now,
Yeah.
and then, just as we read books, because our books, intertextuality permeate into our minds when we create, AI may also permeate into our consciousness. But we'll leave it there, viewers. You can think about these issues and let us know what you think. Please comment on some of our podcasts, write to us, share and subscribe to our channel, and support us any which way you can through word of mouth, because this is all about Vak going towards Paravak. Thank you, Dr. Singh, and do join us, viewers, again in our Poetry Lab. Namaste.